では続きまして、ハーバード大学 T.H チャン公衆衛生大学院国際保健人口学部人口統計学准教授マルシア・カストロ先生にご講演をお願いいたします。カストロ先生はブラジル社会保障省勤務を経てタンザニアで大規模幼虫防除プログラムの共同指導ダルエス・サラームJICA コンサルタントとして幼虫減少のための環境管理プロジェクトに携わってこられました。詳細なご経歴はお手元の小録37ページ、英文ですと75ページになりますのでご参照ください。本日はリオ2016年オリンピック・パラリンピックの経験から一般国民の健康づくりへの影響を学ぶと題しましてご講演いただきます。それではカストロ先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
Thank you. So I just want to start thanking the Tokyo Medical Association for putting together this timely and really important discussion and for inviting me to be here. So for those that were here yesterday, I spent a lot of time talking about the preparedness and what happened during and after the games. Today I'm really going to focus on the legacies, particularly on the health legacies related to the Rio 2016. And what I'll do is I'll briefly just say a few things about what we call Olympic legacies. Then I'll spend most of my time talking about the legacies in 2016 in Rio, what was planned and what was achieved, and then I'll draw a few lessons from that. So regarding to legacies, there are three things I want to highlight to start with. One is that we don't have to wait until the end of the games to see legacies. Some of those actually happen even before the games start. And this can be programs, can be infrastructure, so they actually happen before, during, and after the games. The second thing is finding the right time to evaluate if you achieve the legacies or not is not an easy decision. If you evaluate too soon, you may miss the impacts that could have been observed. And the third thing is that if you take the document from the Olympic Committee, you're going to see that there are 5 categories of legacies that they present. And you don't see health in here, but health cuts across all of those. This is the definition of a health legacy of the Olympic Games. And there is one particular thing I want to highlight in this definition is the fact that they are talking about sustainable, that's important, positive health impacts on the host city or country. And that's important to keep in mind. So the legacy doesn't have to be just for the host city, but it's also for the host country, okay? All right, with that in mind, so what happened in Rio? The very first thing, even before we talk about the legacies, is what Rio had in mind when they put up the candidacy for the Olympic Games. If you read the initial documents, the plan, what the city wanted to achieve with the Games were to strengthen the democracy, to promote socio-economic and urban development, and to improve Brazil's performance on the Games. Now, what is missing right there is health. So when we try to see if a particular city achieved the legacies, we first have to see what they were planning to achieve with the Games. And then you can see what kind of legacies they could achieve. So if you just look at urban development, a big core in the plan was to improve urban mobility. And this is a map of Rio. All those darker areas are the higher density areas. And all those lines that you see in here are different routes of transportation that were created, a combination of new subway lines, rapid bus lines, all kinds of different types of transportation that were high quality transportation to improve the mobility in the city. Now, just to emphasize how important urban development and urban mobility were, this is what happened in terms of costs during the Games. So urban mobility took up 55% of all the money invested, and urban development another 36%. So again, you want to see what they achieved in terms of legacy, you go back to the very first document and figure out what they planned. The big chunk of the money is going in infrastructure in the city. So one question that we could ask, well, if they developed all this urban mobility, all this infrastructure in transportation, who benefited from it? Okay, so I mentioned yesterday that Brazil was hit by a fiscal and political crisis in 2017. Well, the crisis cut in about 70% the budget of the Secretary of Transport in the state of Rio de Janeiro. The consequence of that is that a lot of those new lines that were created, they were eliminated. Some were shortened. And therefore, the entire plan of urban mobility was cut a little bit short right after the games. So if you look at some of the documents and some interviews that the governor had at the time, what we would hear is that the percentage of the population in the city of Rio de Janeiro that had access to high-quality transportation had increased dramatically. And again, the question is, but who are those people using this high-quality transportation? And what we see is this is a study from a friend of mine that just came out. And here I'm only showing you two pictures. So the top one is basically trying to show, considering income levels of the population, who is having more access to high-quality transportation or less access to high-quality transportation to go to their work or to go to public high schools, not private, just public. And in both cases, what we see is it's exactly the high-income people that are having higher access to the better transportation. It's those red areas in here. That's where you have the highest concentration of the population. And this dark blue in here is exactly the low-income population that is having low access to transportation. So we heard Sir Michael talking yesterday about inequities, and what we have in here is that we did have an improvement in urban mobility, but it didn't minimize some of the inequities in access to transport that we had in the city. If anything, it could have made it a little bit worse. Now, in terms of all the infrastructure that's related to health, that's a legacy. So the new hospitals are there, the renovations that were done, they're there. All the equipment that was bought and acquired for the games, they have been redistributed. A lot of them went to this major emergency hospital right at the center of the city. And here what you see are the main reference hospitals during the games. They cover those 4 areas that exactly overlap with the 4 major hubs where we had sports competitions in the city. Now, in terms of health personnel, there was not an increase in the workforce in the city at all. So all those people that were hired as temporary jobs, they were pretty much let go after the games were over. So there was no change in that. Now, in terms of physical activity, and Brian mentioned a little bit about that in London, there is this idea that the host cities will inspire and stimulate lifestyle changes. But just the games won't do it by themselves. The games can be the seed to create the momentum, but you need projects that start before, they continue during the games, but they should have a lifetime that is much longer than the tenure of the games. They have to continue, and this brings us back to that word sustainability in the definition of a health legacy. So first thing is that, as I showed you in the beginning, this was not even in the goals of the Rio Olympic Committee when they decided why they want to host the Olympics there. The physical activity, all those issues were not there. But what I'm arguing here is that it was actually a missed opportunity if we take into account the underlying epidemiological characteristics, not only of Rio, but of the country. And here's one example. Obesity and overweight is a major problem in Brazil now. And in Rio, we have about 56% of the population are overweight, and 20% are obese. So a major missed opportunity in trying to do something to try to mitigate the situation. If we look at physical activity per se, so here we see a minor improvement from 2013 to 16. The numbers for 2017 are not ready yet. This is from a phone interview that is done every year in Brazil. But what we see is that among people that are inactive, which basically means less than 75 minutes of activity during 1 week, it reduced less than 3%, but it's about 13.7% in Brazil, and it's about the same in Rio. So it's a minor decline, but we have to see what's going to happen in 2017. And insufficient activity, so that's people that have less than 30 minutes of exercise per day, it's about 44% of the population in Rio. So again, something could have been done in a much more organized and sustainable way to get those people moving. Now, smoking is a completely different story. Brazil is actually an incredible successful story. In about 3 decades, Brazil reduced the smoking rate in the population from 35% to about 10%, and it's still going down. How did Brazil do that? Well, exactly 30 years ago, 1988, we had our new constitution. And with the new constitution came the new universal health system in the country that basically said that health is a human right, and it's also a duty of the state to provide health to the population. In the same year the constitution was out, there was a law imposing that tobacco companies had to write in the package of cigarettes that smoking may cause harm to your health. Well, over the years, this message in the cigarette packages kept changing from may cause harm to your health to say specific diseases. And then it changed from may cause to will cause. Then it included photos of basically people sick or the lung of a person that had lung cancer because of smoking. And the last thing that they added is that they have to include a phone line, which is a hotline for people that want to get help to give up smoking. Now, in terms of advertising, it was completely banned. TV, radio, newspaper, you name it. And I mean, I grew up in Brazil, and I have to tell you, when I was a kid, the best, coolest commercials on TV were from cigarettes. It was the best lifestyle. They had the best cars, the most beautiful people. It was really tempting. You know, thank God I never liked the smell, because it was really something that many of my adolescent friends would go smoking because of that. The other thing they did is in '96, so this was 20 years before the Olympics, smoking was banned from every single closed space. Governmental departments, movie theaters, libraries, you name it. So when the issue came about smoking, it was a done deal for the Olympics, because for the past 2 decades, smoking was banned in any closed space. So that wasn't even something that needed much discussion. Smoking was banned from every single Olympic venue during the Rio 2016. Another thing that is important is this effort in trying to reduce discrimination, especially with people that had HIV. So Brazil supported an initiative from UNAIDS. So they partnered with the Department of Sexually Transmitted Diseases from the Ministry of Health, and they did this campaign that was called #EuAbraço, which basically means I hug you. The idea was that you would hug a stranger. It could be a gay person, it could be somebody that had HIV, but you would provide support to all the efforts in terms of HIV AIDS control that were being done in Brazil, and also you would show affection and not having discrimination against that person. And there were more than 2 kilometers of hugs that were done just during the Olympics. And those are just some photos that are in the UNAIDS website. If you're wondering how you measure this, you open your arms and you measure that. That's how much the size of your hug. And people would send this measurement to be able to have an idea of how many hugs were given. Now, environment is directly connected to health. So here, one thing that was never fulfilled was to clean the Guanabara Bay, which is heavily polluted, and a lot of the sailing competitions took place there. So they did something like removing some of the floating objects in the water. So during the competition, that wasn't there. But the idea of really cleaning it up, of all the pollution, the pollutants in the water, it really wasn't fulfilled. And if you remember in the opening ceremony, the athletes carried a seed of a tree. And in the end, the Olympic rings were actually with those towers where they were putting all the seeds, and they had the flags of the countries. And the idea was to bring all of those to a greenhouse. They had to reach a certain height, and then they were going to be transferred to a set location that would create the athletes' forest. So this is a picture taken in November last year. These are the seeds in the greenhouse. So they're almost at the right height to be planted to create the forest. The flags are still here, so we know exactly which athlete carried those seeds. And there was a big debate because basically the Rio 2016 Olympic Committee said, oh, we don't have the money to transfer the plants and create the forest. It's going to cost us about $1 million. But the public attorney's office entered in the discussion and said, you basically have to find the money. So the end of this story is still unfolding, but I'm confident that it's going to be a good one, and we're going to have this forest, and it's going to take a few years to grow and become a forest, but stay tuned for that. There are also indirect effects that can be observed, and we tend to neglect those. Here, there are a few things we can think about. One is all this high-quality transportation, which is supposed to have less emissions. They can reduce air pollution, which then have an impact on health. There were several new open spaces, so the entire port area that was ugly, completely abandoned, was completely renovated and became a space for leisure. There is a new museum there, so lots of people circulating in this space that continue after the Olympics. The question is, how do we measure that? How do we actually see if this had any implication on health? And when should we measure that? It's the same discussion I mentioned before. So a few lessons we can draw from this. One of them, which I wish was more emphasized, is the absolutely incredible legacy that the Paralympic Games left for the Brazilian culture, really, for the society. So the example given by those athletes that suffer stigma pretty much on a daily basis, and some of them in particular sports modalities, they won even more medals than the Olympic athletes for Brazil, particularly swimming. This legacy of inclusion is absolutely remarkable. The other thing is Brazil created a training center for Paralympic athletes in São Paulo. This is the center. That's the entire view of the space. That's the entrance of the space. And I had the privilege to visit this center a month and a half before the Olympics. And I saw some of the Brazilian teams training there. It's absolutely high quality. It's actually a reference center for Brazil and for all Latin America. So people from other countries come there to train their teams. This is a major legacy that I have to tell you, I've never seen any Brazilian newspaper talking about this. And this is a shame, because this is absolutely remarkable. It's there, and it's being used. It continues to be used by the Paralympics. And for them, it was really a life changer. It was their Takami Fellowship, this training center right there. Now, then comes reality check. So I told you guys yesterday about the crisis in Brazil. So the internal debt in the city of Rio de Janeiro increased by 40%. The corruption scandals just came out after the games. The former governor is in jail. I mentioned this before. So I guess one of the major issues here is that all those austerity measures really cut the funds for some of the programs that could have continued after the games. And then the typical justification now is we didn't plan for a long-term budget to continue the project. Now, the other thing is, and I think this is my last slide, is the games will create a momentum. They always do. But the question is if the city will be able to leverage this momentum and make it last, because the games are going to be over. And the key issue is there enough planning done to guarantee that the word sustainable in the health legacy will actually be fulfilled? The other thing is, depending on what's done, you can create a major problem in building trust with the community. So if we look at Rio now, with all the problems that are happening after the crisis, both the health sector and security in the city are completely collapsed. So I mentioned yesterday that the satisfaction with health services during the games was 98%. We're not even close. So this is a problem with trust. Imagine Rio trying to do another mass gathering event next year. Forget it. It won't happen because the population won't have any kind of support. And the most important thing in here, which is really food for thought for Tokyo or for any other city that wants to host the Olympic, is what do you really want to achieve with the Games? I told you from the beginning that health was not as a top priority assigned by the Rio Olympic Committee. The issue was about development, period. And I think that was a huge mistake, because if that's not a priority, then the health legacies are not going to be your priority either. So I guess the main lesson that this gives us is that host cities should think very carefully and very wise in deciding what is the goal of hosting the Games, and above all, considering the demographic and the epidemiological characteristics of its population. So with the goal, they can build the legacies that can lead to better well-being of the population. And thank you.
どうもカストロ先生ありがとうございました。リオ2016年のレガシーについていろいろとお話してありました。お二人の先生から以降同であるのですが、やはり評価というのは非常に必要だというお言葉いただいています。評価するために今の現状をきっちりと理解して、それを問題点を抽出して、今回のオリンピックを契機にさらにそれを次の段階に進ませるということだと思います。